Hello again. Welcome to Ideas in Action 20. Today we're going to talk about automation and anxiety, and we're going to talk about it through 5 eras of computing. During that period from the 1960s, we will see how automation and anxiety developed and the directions it has taken as the technologies have changed and expanded. I'm joined by Wendy Currie, Professor and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Information Technology on this particular quest, and we developed a map for navigating through what we have identified as 5 main eras of computing. Each has its own underlying economics, as you will see. Yes, I'm offering you a quick overview of the last 65 years of computing today. So here it is, the diagram in question, and you will see that there are 5 waves of power, really, starting from the 1960s, and each one gets bigger than the previous one. So let's have a look at these eras. The systems-centric era, which was dominated by data centers, mainframes, time sharing, and mini computers. What's interesting about this period is that it was dominated by a certain economics. As each era comes through, you'll see that each one has a distinctive set of economic rules almost that govern how the computing is utilized. So in the period 1964-1981, Grosch's law dominated. Just to state what that law is, computer power increases as the square of the cost. That means the computer that is twice as expensive delivers 4 times the computing power, or that was the assumption anyway in that period. And that went right through the period from, as I said, about 1964 to about 1981. The second period starts from around about 1982 and goes through to 93. And what we saw then was the PC come through, the personal computer, the PC-centric era, which was dominated by what has been called Moore's law. Semiconductor price performance would double roughly every 2 years. And that has largely remained true throughout this particular period of time and after as well, that semiconductor price performance doubled roughly every 2 years. That was quite an interesting period of time, as you can imagine. And the third era that we then started to ride, as it were, was the period 1994 to 2005, which we call the network-centric era, dominated by Metcalfe's law, which states that the cost of a network rises linearly as additional nodes are added, but the value can increase exponentially. This is the extremely well-known network effect. As you add one node, you increase the value exponentially. They then kicked in the fourth era, what we call the content cloud-centric era, which is dominated by virtualization, integration, software on demand, utility computing. And that particular period was dominated also by the law of transformation, which stated that a business needs to become more bit as opposed to atom-based. Its transformation will be equal to the square of that of the percentage of that industry's value added that is bit rather than atom-based. In other words, stop being physical, become virtual, and in that way, greatly increase the value added to your products and services. That sort of went right through to around about 2020, the content cloud-centric era. We think that the present era that we are in the middle of, probably 2021 to 2035, is the convergence AI-centric era, which for us is dominated by the law of combinatorial innovation, which states, according to us, that the increasing combination of digital technologies in new ways will grow business value exponentially. So there we have it. When you look at the diagram, you have these five waves of computing power, each getting bigger than the next. And it won't surprise you to hear that as a result, automation anxiety has increased over these years, over these 65 years. In fact, it's probably at its highest now than it has ever been in terms of the number of people affected, the number of people anxious, and the level of technology development that we now have relative to, say, 1964. The number of people affected is enormous these days, and that is another factor that greatly increases anxiety. So, three observations I'm going to make from this analysis. First, an era marks out the startup and growth to mass use of information-based technologies. Technological deployment in an era may rise and decline, but in practice, much continues and is built upon during the next phase. Mainframes and PCs, for example, are still massively used today. The Internet and World Wide Web took off in the 1990s and have not stopped growing exponentially. The cloud infrastructure of 2025 was put in place over 30 years ago. The technologies coming on stream from the 2020s will become increasingly embedded. My second observation is that what is noticeable across the eras is the scaling of technological take-up from millions to hundreds of millions and billions of users. See, for example, social media, mobile, cloud, and with this is a correspondingly wide-ranging, even global set of impacts, including automation anxiety. Not surprisingly, automation anxiety has increased correspondingly across the eras, along with the rising power, disruption, and impact these computers and digital technologies have brought with them. The third observation I would make is that major technology investments, including into automation and AI, rarely pay off quickly. We'll circle back onto this theme in later blogs. The historical adoption rates for various information, communication, and digital technologies have been analysed, highlighting trends in how these technologies diffuse across societies. Once commercially available, with notable exceptions, technologies still take between 8 and 28 years to achieve 90% adoption in the developed economies. Thus, our dating of the eras is actually representational, reflecting this kind of evolution, and eras overlap in many points. From the analysis we've done, we arrive at a combination of findings and patterns that further our understanding of automation anxiety. In fact, a number of patterns emerge. The first pattern is the recurring job loss fear. Automation anxiety discourse pervaded across many decades of the 20th century, with much of the debate centering on job and task displacement. An automation crisis in the 1960s created a surge of alarm over technology's job-killing effects, especially in the USA. Historical precedents of the creative destructive impacts of technology have considerably shaped present debates, expectations, and anxieties. Undoubtedly, this psychologically framed the technological developments that followed as anxiety-inducing. Thus, in subsequent decades, we have seen the rise of internet-based intelligent technologies, new forms of work through digital platforms, flexible work regimes, and novel human-machine augmentation. In the 21st century, machines and automations continue to drive worries about employment and job loss. Thus, job and task displacement is psychologically linked to technology and impacts the collective imagination. This creates an instinctive fear of new technologies and leads to a transference of what may be multiple anxieties into the one concrete possibility of job loss. It has become the idée fixe of any debate about technology, regardless, actually, of the real likely impacts on work. The second point I would like to make is there is a technology regulation lag. Over the past 65 years, the advances of computing technologies has consistently outpaced efforts to regulate their development, usage, and societal impacts. By 2005, the technology regulation gap was commonly perceived as up to 7 years, depending on the issue. We have seen that the timeline and disparities have only grown much larger as the technologies become more complex and impactful, and the stakeholders more numerous, anxious, and often more litigious. One fundamental regulatory concern throughout has been to strike a balance between stimulating innovation and protecting the interests of different stakeholders, human rights, and societal well-being. This balancing act has proved challenging globally. Awareness of this growing technology regulation gap greatly increased across the first 20 years of the 21st century. It has now come to a head and is converting into serious automation anxiety. The European Union has, since the early 2000s, promoted various kinds of IT and digital regulation, despite complaints from technology vendors and those favoring more market-based solutions. But in the face of rising automation anxiety about AI, its regulation is likely to increase rather than decrease. Regulators are left with trying to achieve a difficult balance between safeguarding safety, fairness, and transparency while fostering innovation and responsible adoption. Effective implementation could reduce anxiety amongst many stakeholders, but also increase anxiety amongst others. Meanwhile, imperfectly applying the rules could have unanticipated consequences for stakeholder automation anxiety levels. There are many other regulatory and advisory initiatives designed to ameliorate AI anxieties, though few are as wide-ranging and enforceable as the EU legislation. The third thing I would like to point out is what I call the FOMO factor, what you know as the fear of missing out factor. In common usage, FOMO stands for fear of missing out. According to Gupta and Sharma 2021, fear of missing out is a unique term introduced in 2004 to describe a phenomenon observed on social networking sites. In 2013, British psychologists elaborated and defined it as a pervasive apprehension that others might be having rewarding experiences from which one is absent. In this latter sense, we can observe recurring FOMO when applied not just to social media phenomena, but to emerging new technologies generally. Thus, FOMO feeds into automation anxiety. While computer-based technologies have always been heavily marketed across the 1964-2025 timeline, it was only when selling moved into the mass PC market from the 1980s, FOMO was an important part of this marketing play throughout the 1980s and can also be observed by way of examples with the internet from the early 1990s, e-business in the late 1990s, mobile phone take-up in the 2000s, enterprise resource planning systems from the 1990s, social media, cloud storage, and more recently, ChatGPT and GAI. So there are two other insights we will deal with in future videos. In the next video, we will examine AI, which is being heralded as ushering in an unprecedented digital future. But in fact, we have heard this rhetoric many times before. In the following video, we will look at the enormous hype that has always accompanied information technology from the 1960s. We will try to debunk much of this for you. Stay tuned and see you next time.